Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fossbender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. I'm having a really great day today. I'm having an especially great day today because I'm counting myself quite fortunate because I get to interview somebody who's been somebody I've admired for a very, very long time. Laura Davis is the author of 7 best-selling nonfiction books, including the seminal book, The Courage to Heal. She's also written I Thought We'd Never Speak Again and has a forthcoming memoir called Wholehearted. She teaches writing workshops in Santa Cruz, California, and leads transformative writing retreats in Tuscany, Peru, Bali, Spain, and other international locations. As the creator of the Writer's Journey Roadmap, Laura sends out free evocative writing prompts by email each Tuesday. I urge everybody to sign up for those. They're fabulous. You can learn more about that by going to lauradavis.net. Laura, thank you so much for being part of the Morning Glory Project. I welcome you wholeheartedly.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored to be here. It's great to talk to you.
Well, I want to add something to your modestly written bio that you didn't write, that I would write. And this is going to make me sound like a gushy fangirl, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Courage to Heal was and remains an important book for so many people who are dealing with overcoming mourning, grieving, living with having survived sexual abuse or child sexual abuse. And it's my belief, having been somebody who not only as a person who read and benefited from that book, but also as a therapist who's used that book with dozens of clients over the years, that without the Courage to Heal, we would not have had a Me Too movement when that happened. I think that your book set the direction for that to even be possible. And so I want to, as an individual, thank you. And perhaps on behalf of many, many thousands of survivors, say thank you as well.
You're very, very welcome.
There. Now I'll stop gushing just a little bit. Just a tiny, tiny bit. Laura, I'm wondering, one of the things that strikes me is what it must be like to be the person, and I know that you co-wrote The Courage to Heal with Ellen Bass. I wonder what it's like to be the person behind that book. And I know that so many, particularly women, not exclusively women, but particularly women, would just do what I'm doing now, which is kind of glom onto you like you're magic in some way. And I wonder what it was like for you to experience being kind of in the eye of that hurricane of unearthing the secrets of sexual abuse and surviving that.
It's a great question. The first thing is this was a long time ago.
When did it come out? 84?
Courage to Heal came out in 1988, so it's been 32 years. And I was all of 31 years old when it was published, and I was 28 years old when I began writing it with Ellen Bass. And not only was I like a babe, I'm actually, my son is turning 27, so my middle son. So when I think about his age and my age, it's kind of shocking. But not only was I very young when I started this, I was absolutely in the throes of dealing with my own incest, which had been perpetrated by my grandfather. And I had been one of the people who had forgotten it, repressed the memories. And I only remembered when I was 27. So 1 year later, Ellen and I were writing The Courage to Heal.
Wow.
So I was deep in my own process. I was, thinking about sexual abuse morning, noon, and night. I was having flashbacks. I was falling apart. I was certain that I was far too damaged to ever love anyone or have a relationship. I was in complete crisis. And at the same time, I was interviewing dozens, and then up to like a couple hundred women survivors of sexual abuse in great detail about their healing process and what they had experienced. And those interviews I was actually had worked as a reporter before that, but they were in no way objective. Whatever I was struggling with would be the subject of that day's interview. So if I was dealing with, my sexuality is broken, we would talk a lot about sex. If I was struggling with my mother and the fact that she was disowning me and, insisting that none of this could ever have happened because it was her father who was the perpetrator, I would ask people about their relationships with their family. And so that's how I did those interviews. And it's interesting because I was incredibly fortunate as a young writer because I teamed up with Ellen Bass, who actually I had dinner with last night, interestingly enough. And Ellen is about 9 years older than me. So she was the senior writer, and she had already published several books and had already published a book about incest called I Never Told Anyone, which was the very, very first book published where women told their stories of having been sexually abused as children. It was a huge, groundbreaking book. And it was Harper and Row at the time had published that. And the book was doing well, and they wanted a sequel. So I was incredibly fortunate because I teamed up with Ellen on this book, which is a story in itself, how that came about. And for my very first book, I had a publisher, I had an agent, I had an editor, and this book was going to be published. But the whole time I was writing it, it took us 3.5 years to write the book. I was convinced it would never be published, that it was far too radical. There were, all these lesbians in the book, and it was, calling out the patriarchy, and it was a very radical book. It still is, actually, but at the time it was incredibly groundbreaking. And I just thought once they saw the manuscript, they would never publish it.
Do you think that maybe gave you some freedom to go farther because you just
Exactly.
didn't really think you would
That's
go
just
there
what I was
anyway?
going to say, is that I think I had to believe that, or I couldn't have ever found the courage to write it.
I wonder if that's just a necessary thing for memoir writers. Just pretend no one's ever going to read it.
Yeah.
Just write it.
I had to do that for the memoir I just finished. I had to tell myself, I need to write this story, but I don't have to publish it. I could decide later.
So here you were, raw from your own discovery of your own survivorness. You're talking to survivors every day. You're writing this. It's morning, noon, and night. I'm just wondering, how did you get through that? What were the touchstones or things that you hung on to kind of weather that typhoon?
Well, I had a very good therapist. That was really essential. And I think at one point I was seeing her twice every week. And I was like really broke. I mean, for me to pay for therapy was a huge stretch, but it was my number one priority. I had a bunch of roommates. I lived in a flat in San Francisco. I had 3 part-time jobs, and I was paying to go to therapy twice a week. So I had a good therapist. And Ellen was a fantastic, Ellen had worked with survivors. So she was always, she wasn't my therapist, but she was like
supportive friend.
A friend. She was a good friend who knew the territory. And the other thing that really helped me at the beginning was I joined a writing group with Sandra Butler, who was the author of the book Conspiracy of Silence. And it was a writing group for incest survivors. And that class it just opened the floodgates of writing about my experience. And for me, writing has always been an incredible tool for healing, for self-discovery, for understanding my decisions, my options, for venting, for everything. And so in a way, I wrote my way through it. I filled dozens and dozens and dozens of notebooks. So that really helped. And then I think writing the book was helpful. I sort of powered my way through. And I really felt at that time like I would never get through it. It felt to me like the quote unquote healing process was just one more torture in a long line of tortures. Like I just could not see that there was going to be another side where I would have a life that was not obsessed with sexual abuse, where I wouldn't feel broken and traumatized. Mm-hmm. But actually the process we wrote about does work, because it worked for me and it's worked for millions of others.
That there is another side. It doesn't mean that, of course, all of the loss and pain and the wound goes away, but that it does heal. It does diminish over time.
You have to work at it. Time does not heal this wound. You can't ignore it or stuff it or
Mm-hmm.
medicate it or drug it away. You have to face it. And, it's interesting because now, 30 years later, we're in a culture that has even less respect for long term psychotherapy, where a lot of psychological problems, emotional problems, like medicate them. And it doesn't work for trauma.
No.
It's not that medication can at some point be a useful tool. I don't mean to say it can't, it saves people's lives, but it will not enable you to do the deep healing that is required if you actually want to reclaim your life and take your power back.
Right. Or if it does, it gives you the ability to do the work, but it doesn't do the work for you.
Yes, it gives you the stability to do it. Yeah.
Anais Nin said when somebody asked her why she wrote, she said, "I write to taste life twice."
Mm.
And I've always thought, for me, it's not that I write to understand it once. I have to kind of retreat to my writing cave to write, to sort of understand what this thing is. It's like a talking to yourself process. It sounds like that's in part what that was for you too, is like you said, you wrote your way through it.
Yeah.
That you wrote through your way through your own memories, you wrote your way through your own process of all that, your mom's denial, all of that stuff that you had to write your way through that, in addition to therapy and good support from friends and all of that.
Absolutely. You started out by asking about, when The Courage to Heal came out, I was 31 years old, like a baby, I would say now. And it was, I never thought the book would take off the way it did. It through grassroots, it was passed from woman to woman and woman to man. A lot of men have read that book from hand to hand to hand. This was way before the internet. There was no social media. When we tried to get people to interview, we had to put little notes on bulletin boards and in the back of printed newsletters. So it was a different world, but yet the news of that book just spread. And in 6 months, it had a complete life of its own. And I was catapulted into a extremely public life that I had not anticipated or wanted.
It went viral before there was viral, but here you are. From everything I've read that you've written, you're a natural introvert. It wasn't ever your ambition to be famous or to be so conspicuous. And here, like you said, you were just catapulted into a world you didn't expect. And by the way, I, as a reader of Courage to Heal, had no fantasy about what this was like for you as the authors of it. That just wasn't my orientation at that time. And now, on the other side of it, I've been thinking about this got catapulted in the world, and it was not a world that welcomed this information completely. While there was this viral hunger for it among survivors, there was a whole bunch of people not so happy about this.
Yeah, I think, whenever you do something that where you're putting a stake in the ground and you're taking a stand, and we took an extremely strong, passionate stand, you're going to have people who adore you and love you and revere you. And sometimes that's uncomfortable. And you're going to have people who don't care about what you're doing. And you're going to have people who hate you. And so, when you get that public, you become that visible. And we were the face of the movement that began with that book.
And how did that take form? What were the haters like? What was that?
Well, there was many parents who had been accused of sexually abusing their children, and a large percent, 99.99% of them said it hadn't happened, and most of those people were lying because they were covering their own tracks. And a group of those people got together and they founded something called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation that basically was established to discredit the stories of survivors. And they had got tons of press, they got tons of attention, and they came after us. They came after a lot of therapists. And, it's like there's always a backlash when there's forward progress on any social issue. There's a backlash. We're seeing that in our country right now, very obviously. After having the first Black president, look what we have. So it's a natural part of the process of change, actually, as much as we hate it. So we were that backlash came right after us, and that was very challenging.
You're saying it's a natural backlash, and I believe you. I know it to be true, but I wonder how very few people that are starting work that to do good in the world, to do this thing, how many of them don't even think through that they're that there might be this kind of reaction and backlash and resistance. I bet it was completely unanticipated for you.
Completely unanticipated. I mean, especially because we were just adored for a long time. I mean, it took a while for the backlash to gather steam. And I think it was a sign of how successful the book was. And I don't mean successful in terms of how many copies it sold. I mean successful in terms of waking up survivors to become activists. And once there was like a whole groundswell of people standing up, just like the Me Too movement, there's always going to be pushback.
Hmm. Well, you also said that the adoration was sometimes uncomfortable too.
For me, it was because I started speaking around the country, and I would be standing up alone on a stage with like a little glass of water and a few tattered note cards and a spotlight on me. And I would talk about my experience and about the healing process. And, at those times, I still feel this when I'm teaching. If I'm teaching at a retreat, there's a way when I put myself in a position of speaking or teaching, that there's a certain, I'm a little reluctant to use this word, but there's a kind of grace that happens where my smaller personality self gets out of the way, and I really am able to draw on some kind of strength that comes through the universe through me to be a channel for something. And I don't use that word lightly. I mean, I'm not like a woo-woo person, but that is actually what the experience is. So I would travel around and I would give these talks, and I would feel this almost like an elevated state of consciousness. And I would feel like this healing energy was coming through me into this whole audience of women who were hurting, and often in a real state of agony and distress. And there would be something very powerful that would be generated. And when it was over, I would feel incredibly depleted because I didn't have the inner resources to really stand up to that kind of energy. And also, then there would be, hundreds of women coming up and telling me their story. And I just wasn't equipped. I was young. I was still in my own process of healing. I've learned so much more about how to teach, how to hold that kind of energy. So I would feel overwhelmed. And at the end of the night, I would go back to my hotel room, and I would often feel just really devastated. And some of it was just having handled all that energy. And some of it was like, I felt like I'm not the person they think I am, because I still felt so damaged at that point. And I felt very lonely. I was away from home. I was on the road, and I had no one to go home to. I had friends, but I felt too damaged to have a spouse or a partner or a lover. And it was very challenging. There was just such a schism between the public me and the internal me. And it's taken decades to heal that rift and to feel like the Laura who's out in the world teaching or whatever is the same as the Laura on the inside. There's not that gap anymore. But that took years, decades to get there.
I wonder also, I mean, that misconception on your part, uh, I hesitate to call it that, but that kind of, I guess what I was going to start to say is I also wonder that readers must have projected a lot of assumptions onto you, that you were why they kind of guruized you. Is that, if that's not even a word, but they kind of wanted that kind of, you've arrived, you must have a special wisdom, and you must be extra specially healed. Therefore, they're sort of having an expectation of you being in a different place, as opposed to, hey, you know what? I'm one of you all. I'm just on this road too, and I may be one or two steps further along, but not all. Not It's not done. I wonder if some of that was going on.
That did happen a lot. And, I like now, it's interesting. Now I do a lot of things to counter that because I still get that kind of attitude. Not attitude, that kind of like that energy coming toward me. Like, for instance, when I teach, I often sit on the floor and I often take my shoes off. I mean, these are very conscious things I'm doing to make myself low. Like, I don't want to sit in the fanciest chair in the room. I want to be on at the same level as other people. And I think it's not to say that I do feel like I have something to offer, and I do have some wisdom that I have gathered over these many decades, and I haven't, I teach writing now. I have information to share, but I really do everything I can to discourage that cloak of being the guru, because I'm just not comfortable with it. And I think it also is a trap for people who have some degree of public notoriety. It's very easy to step into that, but to me, it's a false identity.
Me too. I've had the honor of knowing some people who are performers, and I think that sometimes if there's too big of a disparity between the onstage persona and the private, that it sort of splits them in a way where neither world becomes fully comfortable.
Well, that's where I think that's where a lot of drug and alcohol abuse come in for
Yeah,
people.
well, to bridge the gap between the two beings. Well, in addition to writing and therapy and friends, I'm wondering, in terms of your own recovery, your personal recovery from incest, as well as your own just growth process, I'm wondering if there are times when you have to reaffirm a decision or a practice or something that when you catch yourself getting off, getting off the road, getting off balance, what you do to continue your healing and growth process. If there's a decision that you make or a resource that you use or a practice that you employ.
It's interesting when you say that. I think about this woman I interviewed for the Courage to Heal. I'll never forget her. And she said that she had been someone who was always going to these healing workshops and human potential seminars and therapy. And when she went to Mexico for several weeks and just like was living on the beach and having a really relaxing time, and she came home and she said her home mailbox was full of these circulars. This is before the internet too. All these circulars for human growth programs. And she said she just threw them all out. She said to herself, you know what? I'm done fixing myself. I'm good enough the way I am. And I think there's something. I'm certainly someone who is always committed to healing and growth for myself and in my teaching, and I feel like I'm going to evolve till I die. That's my orientation in life. But I did feel like there was a point where I had to feel like this is good enough. It's like being the good enough parent, or the
Yeah.
good enough spouse, or the good enough friend, because. It's like I want to live. I don't want to just be growing all the time. That being said, I have a whole toolbox, of things that work for me. And one is I love being out in nature. This is really important to me. So I hike a lot. Right now I'm sitting in my office looking out the window at trees, and I need to be out in nature. I need to move my body. I right now I'm just in the past year or so. I'm swimming 4 days a week, 4 or 5 days a week, and I'm walking a lot, and I feel so great being physical and in my body. And that's been a struggle for me for a lot of my life.
Which is the case for lots of abuse survivors, that being present in their own body is so difficult.
I think the other thing I want to say is that I will always be an incest survivor, but I don't identify as an incest survivor. Like, 35 years ago, if you'd asked me who I was, I would have said I'm an incest survivor, and that would have been my primary identity. Now it doesn't even make the list. I say I'm a teacher, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a wife, I'm a friend, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a writer, I'm an author, and I could go on and on and on. I'm a mahjong player, I'm a kombucha maker. I could go on with all the things I am, and I would not say I'm an incest survivor. I mean, I am, but it feels like it's like in the fabric of the cloth that shaped me, and it will always have an impact on me. Like there's always going to be certain vulnerabilities, and I think when I'm in a very, a deeply stressful moment in my life, which could be for any reason, where I feel really, really vulnerable or something terrible happens in my life, that vulnerability is always there. And, I've done many years of therapy, and I accept myself as a broken person who's mended, and I think some people say we're stronger in the broken places. Sometimes I believe in that, and sometimes I think I don't believe it. I wish I didn't have certain vulnerabilities. And there's certain ways that I have become a much stronger, more capable person. And I feel like I have fulfilled my life's purpose in part because of what I went through. And incest was only one of a number of things that shaped me. But I also feel like it's created certain places where I'm not as strong, I'm not as capable. And I accept that.
There's something kind of beautiful, though, about the thing that was so that you were living and breathing and dealing with 24/7 at one point in your life has now receded into the background and given way to these other life events and realities and people that you are, mother, grandmother, lover, partner, wife, all of those things. I know now too that you've transitioned to another phase, and that is that you've written and are in pursuit of publishing a new memoir called Wholehearted. Can you talk a bit about, first of all, I love that title, Wholehearted. That kind of reflects what you were just saying, that you're not just this one piece of you, that you're whole. But I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about what Wholehearted is and why it is you chose to write it.
Yeah, Wholehearted is, it took me 10 years to write that book, and I really struggled to write it. I had many times along the way where I thought, I am not capable. I'm not capable of going deep enough. I'm not capable of telling that much of the truth. I'm not capable as a writer. I don't have the writing chops to pull off this story. And then I also was like, the people left in my family, they're going to be people who are unhappy about this book. And I already went through losing my whole family over The Courage to Heal. Do I really want to go through that again after I have repaired so many of those relationships? So there are a lot of reasons that I had to tell myself I don't have to publish it. But I also felt like I needed to write it. And basically I call it the story of two souls who could not quit each other. And the memoir is shaped, it's seen through the vantage point of my relationship with my mother. She died 5.5 years ago. And she was a very powerful, dramatic, passionate, generous, intense woman. And she and I were two very intense personalities that were on a collision course from the time I was an adolescent. And we both were compelled to want to connect with each other and repelled by each other, and had a long estrangement where we didn't speak. And then gradually began to reconnect. And the thing about her father having abused me and me writing The Courage to Heal was the last straw in the breaking down of our relationship. And I think the birth of my son, my first son, when I was 36, was the beginning of our reconciliation. And I ended up taking care of her the last 6 years of her life. When she had dementia, and we had actually healed quite a bit of our relationship, but only to a certain level. And that level was that she lived in New Jersey and I lived in California. And when she was 80, she moved out to California, to my town, and that proximity, and then her needs as someone aging and the way her dementia manifested brought up all the old conflict, that seemingly had been resolved. And so, it was a very intense last 6 or 7 years of her life. And this book is the story of that relationship, basically from the time I was born until the time she died. I feel like it's the story of, it's really deals with the next level of healing for me, which was, can I really open my heart? Because I've been a very functional person for a lot of my life. I'm a really great doer and manifester. I manifest more than almost anyone I know. I'm really good at making things happen and having an impact in the world, but really being open-hearted. That's why the book is called Wholehearted, has been much more of a challenge. And through that relationship with my mother, I really had to work hard to, it was a dance, and that's the story I tell, the story of that relationship.
I wonder, Laura, I hadn't thought of it exactly this way, but I wonder how many people whose loved one, often a parent, not always, develops some kind of illness and certainly dementia among them prominently, where you almost get a second round at relationship with each other under new management,
Yeah.
and I wonder if that was the case for you and your mom, if her dementia that was both troubling and humbling and transforming of her kind of made it possible to have the resolution of the relationship on the same coast, not with 3,000 miles between you.
I mean, yes and no. Anyone who's dealt with someone who has dementia knows that they go through a lot of different stages.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother had times where she was incredibly difficult, where she was demanding, she was hostile, she was hysterical, she was, falling apart. And then she also had a time where she turned very sweet, which is not what I anticipated. I thought she would be someone who would turn kind of bitter and nasty, but she turned incredibly sweet. So I had a couple of years of her. I'd come into her room and she'd say, "You're the best daughter in the whole world."
Oh,
How
wow.
I had longed to hear that my whole life. And suddenly, I was in my 50s and my mother was saying this to me. The same mother who had been, incredibly judgmental and hard and difficult and intense and dramatic and emotional was like looking at me like Jesus had been reborn and walked into her room. I mean, she was Jewish, so she wouldn't have said that. But, that was an incredible experience. And yet it wasn't the same mother. She wasn't the same person. So it
Right.
was a very mixed experience for me because I longed for that love, that pure love, because her personality structure wasn't there anymore. Her intense personality structure had been broken down, but yet she wasn't the same person, and I just think I learned so much about this incredibly deep loyalty that goes way beyond our thoughts of what things should be. And it transformed me. It was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had I feel like it has impacted me since because I am more capable of love than I was before she died.
Mm.
And for me, that's always the last frontier. I mean, I'm surrounded by people who love me, and I love people. But there's a way, I don't know, maybe other people who are survivors will understand that there still are some places that are very hard to open, and they've been opening. So I'm really grateful about that.
Mm. It builds a little moat around us, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
Sometimes
does. It does.
what we've endured. Laura, I'm so glad to be talking with you today and so grateful that you would spend this time. I would have asked what letter might you write to somebody who is a new survivor or is just discovering that, but really you've already done that. The Courage to Heal has come out in many, what edition is it in now? Many, many?
Many, many, yeah.
Many, many editions. And for those who can find healing in those pages, I know that that's your beautiful love letter to them. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for this time today and for sharing your story with us.
You're very welcome.
It was my honor and great privilege today to have a conversation with Laura Davis. I've long admired the work that she and Ellen Bass did in creating Courage to Heal, but I have a confession. In all of the years that I've benefited from that book, both for myself, for my therapy clients, for friends to whom I've shared it, I honestly never once thought about the cost of what that was like for its writers, how much resistance they got, how much pushback, how many threats they received, and how hard that was for them. The extra bloom for me is I'm going to be a little more conscious going forward of the brave writers that I recognize, the innovators, the trailblazers, the first ones in the front line who take so much heat. I'm grateful for the work that she did, and I know that it lives on and that an entire generation of women and some men along there too have benefited from the healing work that was offered in that book. That's a big enough extra bloom. For those of you who are writers or want to be, or even just want to explore your own memories, Laura Davis holds workshops both online and in person in the Santa Cruz area, as well as in places all over the world as exotic as Peru. You can find out more about Laura Davis and what she offers by going to lauradavis.net, and there you can get information. Thanks so much for listening to the Morning Glory Project. I'm pleased that you could take this time today and listen to this amazing story. Go out and bloom.